Okay, cool. We're rolling. So, Tom, episode 3. We've both got big and heavy bags underneath our eyes. It's been a bit of a rough week, I'm sure. How are you doing, mate? Let's start there.
I'm all right. Yeah, I think you had a rocky week last week, and I've had
I
a bit
did.
of a rocky week this week.
Yeah.
Different things. So yeah, my brain's full of stuff, and hope that'll make some sense tonight. How are you?
Yeah. Yeah. I had a fatherly first today. I was projectile vomited onto by my daughter. So I was giving her a cuddle, and she was not very well, bless her, and it was totally unexpected. And I was just holding her here, and it just went whoosh, and I'm holding it like expletive. Oh my god, oh my goodness, and it just kept coming. It must have been, I kid you not, it must have been about eight vomits, just white
Brilliant.
t-shirt, white t-shirt. Now it's brown, and my wife was just looking at me like, "I'm so glad you're here because if you weren't here, I would not have managed."
I was
So
holding my church the other week and chatting to someone new, just holding him for ages. And when I finished chatting to this guy, I looked down and I was like, "Oh, he's completely leaked through." And it's swollen. Did this new guy who I was speaking to just politely not mention anything about the fact that I'm covered in a kid's wee?
just a yellow patch growing through the conversation. Gosh, we can laugh about that. We can laugh about that. Thank God for washing machines, eh? And showers. She went straight in the shower. She was clean in 2 minutes. Modern plumbing and washing machines are a godsend. Um, so we've had some positive feedback on this here podcast, if we can dare to call ourselves a podcast. And
Watch out.
one of the questions that's been coming up was about our attitudes towards immigration, and I'm quite forthright about this matter. I think the Bible is really explicit, and I think where the Bible is very, very clear, it's an imperative for God's people to be very, very clear. And so I thought I'd drop a rhetorical hand grenade into the midst of all of our listeners and say that I think Shamima Beghum, before she went to ISIS, was should absolutely have been allowed into Great Britain. No problems, no questions asked. I don't think there should have been any checks, balances, passports being taken, anything like that. I think that was a massive overreach of the state. So I thought we'd start the episode at 60 miles an hour and then maybe, slow down on the motorway and lose all of our subscribers along the way.
What's the context? What were they worried about initially then when she came into the country?
So the Shamima Begum is either a mastermind criminal or she is a rather naive, tragically abused, damaged, and manipulated young lady. She happens to be Muslim. And my understanding was that she left the UK, she left Britain, and she travelled to what was then the so-called caliphate, what ISIS claims to be controlling. And she became, a jihadi bride, presumably a fighter, took her as his bride. She became pregnant with a child, and that child died quite tragically in a refugee camp, I believe in Turkey. So she is younger than me, and she has gone through more grief and pain and abuse than I hope I and every member of my family combined will ever have to go through.
Yeah.
I don't have all the details off the top of my head, but basically she was denied re-entry. But even though she's a British citizen, she was denied re-entry into the UK. You right, love?
Ah,
Huh? Yeah, we're recording as well.
yes.
Yeah. Sorry, babe. That's making it to the cut. So she was denied citizenship By the way, if any listener can correct me if I get anything wrong, it's not out of a malevolent spirit at all. I'm human, but I know that either her passport was taken, and basically she was told you are no longer welcome in this country. As soon as I hear a government take that stance towards a criminal, now remember, all this girl did is she went abroad and supported a very unpleasant, I would argue, criminal organization. By rights is possibly therefore also a criminal by association, but she publicly repented of that. She didn't recant Islam, okay, but she regretted having gone to ISIS. And the argument that was made, I mean, there she was in a refugee camp on a grainy video with human rights lawyers basically trying to get back to her family in the UK. And she was basically suspected of being an extremist, whatever that means, because the goalposts change and they can quickly change. And she was suspected of being a quote jihadi bride that was going to come back and, you know, either herself conduct or inspire and groom others to commit acts of terrorism. My problem is that it gets a bit murky once she's gone, but I really do not believe that the British government at any point should have the right to deny someone entry into a country. Period. So maybe someone's committed a crime, and at that point they should be dealt with. But the whole rhetoric is perhaps what I'm hinting at. The whole rhetoric of the British government towards Shamima Beghum was absolutely awful. You know, it just dehumanized an individual. And it was so, I mean, here we are, two Christian fathers. Okay, she's a Muslim. She doesn't share our religion. She does not know Jesus. And yet the response of the British people were like baying hounds at the smell of blood to this woman. And I was sickened by it, to be honest. I was absolutely sickened, and I thought it a ghastly cherry on the top of the whole story that the child that she had, let's face it, she was probably raped, and now it comes out in the news, likely trafficked as well. Here's, you know, the total opposite of a fairy tale, and there's a human being at the heart of it. And her situation is slightly different in that she went and she supported a very, very unpleasant regime. But she publicly repented of that. She said, I wish I hadn't done it. Please, can I come home? And my point is, Big Daddy government closed the door, literally said, borders are closed to you. You can't come home. And that terrifies me, because whenever the government does that to the foreigner, you can be sure at some point, maybe not to you, maybe not to your children, but at some point down the line, they will start doing that to the so-called natives. Whatever power we give to the government to oppress and abuse the stranger and the foreigner will eventually be used upon us.
Yeah, I take a slightly different view. They can push back if you want, but I think that the government should have that ability to deny someone re-entry into a country if it believes that it is in the interest of national security, as a deterrent to possibly avoiding further radicalization, things like that. But the question is, was that the case in this instance? And obviously, I don't know. Can't be the judge and arbiter of that. But I do think the government should have that power, because I think that, I mean, I suppose the other question is, what does she do? Where does she go? Now that she has expressed regret, is the government saying that they don't believe her? You know, I'd like to know more. There's a lot more to it. It's complex, and as you say, trafficking. I'm just reading here. So she was 9 months pregnant. The baby died of pneumonia, and apparently she lost 2 other children previously.
Yeah,
pretty horrific. And like you say, who knows? We don't quite know the exact story there. Well, I don't anyway. behind how she lost those children, how they were conceived, etc. Um, yeah, there's a lot there. I take a slightly different view that I do think that it should be within the government's power, but whether or not it's right in this case, I get your point though. You're sort of saying it opens a dangerous precedent for what the government can do and the power it can wield.
I would say that as a quote Jihadi bride, she's gone over there very naive. I mean, there were even a few, I think there were two Austrian girls, maybe a Swiss girls that had gone over, a few girls from Scotland. And, you know, maybe they went there initially wanting to make a difference and to serve the prophet. I don't know. But I promise you, when they got there, life was hell. And what crimes did they commit? I don't know. Maybe they did. Maybe they assisted in murder. Could possibly be the case. And remember, I'm talking about people that decapitated our brothers and sisters in Christ and rejoiced in it. You know, I'm not here like ISIS went bad. ISIS were awful. Most of those fighters were mad dogs that needed to be put down. And I would gladly have done that myself. But I'm not in a position, I don't have the skills to do that. But that would have been a righteous thing, to meet them on the field of battle and just end them. But when it comes to individuals that have gone over there, possibly with the wrong idea in mind, or they've been sold a dream and they want to come home, my question is, okay, what have they actually done wrong? What crime have they actually committed? Maybe they have. Maybe they haven't. And if they haven't committed a crime,
yeah, I get your point.
They're not a criminal. And added to that, I am extremely suspicious of a government that denies entry to people on the basis of suspicion. Because all of a sudden, we are denying the foreigner, let's be honest, the Muslim, even if they're British Muslims, in our nation, we are extremely suspicious of them. And I dare say a few of them probably deserve that suspicion. But remember, we're using broad brushstrokes here, and that's dangerous. So we're denying the foreigner and the stranger the right to be innocent until proven guilty. And my kind of riposte is the Patriot Act in America, which has been used to basically oppress and trying to find a word other than criminalize, but I have to use criminalize innocent people until they're proven innocent by border control. You know, you're given the red light, you know, the green light, you know, you tick through, yeah, you can come through the border. We don't suspect you, but you're guilty, you're assumed guilty until proven innocent. And there are roles that the state does have. The state definitely has the right. It wields the sword. It has the right to punish criminals. Terrorism is this, in most cases, an absolute bogeyman that's used to increase state power. Now, in parts of the world, terrorism is a real threat. In this country, it is not a real threat. There are definitely, you know, people that would like to blow stuff up, but we are at far more risk of the king, you know, to use the biblical example, Pharaoh, accruing more power and just deepening his tyranny invisibly every single day. I'm far more afraid of, you know, border control and the police and the secret services kind of going way out of their lane and overstepping their boundaries. Way more worried about that than I am a lone wolf doing something stupid and detestable. And I honestly feel like unless Shamima Beghum can be proven to have committed a crime, and I do not believe that going and being in the presence of enemies is a criminal act.
I suppose the other thing with she's got such a high profile, if they did let her back in, security services would be very closely monitoring her activity to find out what she's up to, if there is anything untoward going on, if she is kind of radicalizing people.
I mean, that's a good point. That's a good point.
She's got such a high profile, so she'd be quite exposed in that regard.
But my question is, do the security services even have the right to do that?
No, fair enough. Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. What do you think more broadly this year? There's
Yeah.
been a lot of, obviously, Home Secretary Suella Braverman.
Mm.
She's been sort of talking the tough talk, if you will, in regards
Hmm.
to illegal immigration. We've seen, what was it, 4,000 in one day coming over the channel, I think. Some crazy numbers in terms of people coming over on these boats.
Yeah, we should be terrified, shouldn't we? Absolutely
Um,
terrified. Not.
what do you think more? I mean, obviously, there's a lot to it. So you've got, I read the thing about this. I read a story today, a guy from Albania who came over, and he was very honest when he got here. He paid lots of money. I think his granddad was quite ill. He was coming over to try and earn some money to look after his granddad. Paid a fair amount of money to these, the real sort of criminals within it all, who are dangerously taking
Yeah,
lots of money.
the
These dangerous
traffickers. Yeah,
traffickers. He came over and he was very honest. He said he wasn't claiming asylum. He was an economic migrant. He was just coming over to work and earn some money for his granddad. And he got deported back to Albania. And he would say
yeah,
to anyone, "Don't do it. I've lost loads of money. I'm in debt." That was
yeah.
quite an interesting story. But
So I wonder, by the way, just as a slight interruption there, I wonder whether he's been used by the Home Office as a almost like an advert to basically try and dissuade people from coming over.
is that
Um,
not, is that not a good thing though, for his own safety as much as anything else?
oh well, we're entirely responsible covenantally, right? So in all of these things, we're talking ethical, judicial, covenantal. There is a collective representation before the throne of God for the people of Britain. And that's why we have to be agitating for righteousness, because as God said, as God says in the Old Testament, if you're silent, he says in the New Testament as well, if you're silent in matters of injustice, I will demand it of you as well. If you do not cry out when there's blood being spilled, that blood's on your hands. So who's responsible? I don't know which Home Secretary. The Home Secretary at the end of the day is just a sentient puppet, a figurehead for us, for a department. It's the same permanent civil service and same, that kind of work the machinery in the background. They don't change with each new regime. But the truth of the matter is that Albanian gentleman should have been absolutely permitted to come through. He should have been given every right to set up peaceably wherever he chooses in this nation, and provided he was willing to, I speak as a Christian here, but willing to acknowledge publicly, i.e., not disturb the peace by preaching another religion, introducing another law like Sharia, and undermining the Christian constitution that I wish for this country.
So
He's
should we
not.
allow? So,
He's not.
so just to go for the other side. So should we allow anyone who wants to move here to set up life here to do so? What's the limit on that?
Well, there isn't a limit on it. I mean, whether things like Interpol, whether police, biblically understood as a peacekeeping organization, whether they could coordinate with others, from around the world to do background checks, criminal record checks, maybe. But fundamentally, we have to abide by God's law, and God's law is that you shall not have a second law for the stranger and the foreigner. You will treat them as you would yourself, your own native-born people. There are laws, there are expectations, and frankly, those laws should be biblical laws, biblically informed laws. The Bible doesn't speak explicitly about cryptocurrency, for example, or electric cars, but the principles and the case laws are absolutely abiding and relevant and applicable. So this Albanian gentleman, we have wronged him as a people, and our state, our government, has committed a grievous crime by
If he,
sending him out.
if he knew that there was a chance that if he kind of knew that what he was doing wasn't legal, and he
Ah,
knew the risks,
but it's the
why
difference between legal and lawful, isn't it?
why would he be responsible for him knowingly? if someone's knowingly coming over illegally, why would we be responsible?
Well, my retort to you would be, if there is an unjust law, an unjust and unrighteous statute, is it not the righteous thing to do to resist and ignore that unrighteous statute?
Not for not
When
no.
when tyranny becomes law, is it not the duty of the Christian to rebel?
Well, I'm talking about his duty. I'm talking about the individual's duty. So if they know that they're coming over illegally and not seeking asylum, for example.
Well, in that case, it's almost like, you wrestle with a pig, you're going to get mucky. It's run out of time, 10 minutes.
Yeah. So,
and I use that, by the way, I just want to clarify, I only use that as a metaphor. I'm not referring to any people here. No, I'm not Albanians, nothing else. It's just more the metaphor that if two wrongs don't make a right. So if we've got unrighteous laws and we know that, and we as Christians should be screaming this from the rooftops, our churches should not be silent on this matter. We're scared of 4,000 migrants coming across. Our newspapers are making so much money out of fear porn. 4,000? We have such a labour shortage at the moment. Demographic crisis that is approaching is so terrifying that I don't know how atheists get out of bed. Because if they actually thought through the future of this country, it would paralyze them. Because
the demographic crisis, is that not more to do with the lack of basically we're not having enough kids essentially to support an older age?
It's a combination, Tom.
How would immigration solve the demographic crisis in that regard?
I don't think it would solve it. I think it's a plaster on, a fairly deep and significant wound. This country is antenatal in the sense of anti-baby. We hate babies. We kill them 200 a day. We're both firmly opposed to that. But when it comes to immigrants and letting them in, it just comes down to our base principles. Do we fear the stranger, or do we trust God? And we are willing, on balance, big picture, macro level, looking down, willing to trust God that the vast majority of desperate people, that Albanian man was desperate, and we have wronged him. And I don't know his name. I don't know who he is. So I can't really do anything about it except pray. But I have a friend up in Ripon. They bought a van through an auction, and it turned out that van had been used by Border Patrol, whichever. And that van had been used to deport people and drive them back to the airport. And they discovered a suitcase in the back with a last-minute heartfelt plea from a lady in Zambia. Please save me, help me, I want to stay. The problem is, Tom, that when we bring up the question of legal is to do with the inner runnings of a corporation. It's the inner workings of the corporation. It has nothing really to do with law. If legal matches up with law, brilliant, yes and amen. But we find ourselves in a situation where governments think that they can just introduce an opinion and that makes it law. That was the whole thing over COVID. Whether that was right or not, we're not going to get into that this episode. But if we've got legal, maybe, but if we've got legal statutes that are saying you cannot come in unless you meet these ridiculous tick box, criteria, I would say actually it's the righteous thing to do to ignore that and undermine that. Now, that does not mean, I just want to get ahead of all of the crowd here and turn it into a parade. That does not mean that I'm saying get rid of the criminal justice system, laws, punishments. But if you think about that sadly very famous incident in, I think, Cologne, and it was maybe New Year's Eve, where there was basically just rape gangs in the middle of the town centre. I promise you, Muslim men would fear the British and the European men if rapists were hung or just executed, as God demands. That if you rape a woman or a boy or a man or an animal, okay, that's a death penalty. I promise you, you would see less rape. And the issue is that we do not meet mercy towards the stranger and the foreigner with justice defined by God. And so we're lacking in both areas. And so all we've done is we've swapped mercy and true justice for tyranny. And at the moment, the state is wielding a very, very heavy and arbitrary hand against the stranger and the foreigner. We have nothing to fear, or at least we should have nothing to fear from strangers and foreigners arriving on our shores if we have.
I'm going to push back on that a bit, though. So there's a difference between nothing to fear and what is within our responsibility. So the way I think about it is there has to be some sensible limit to the responsibility. If we think the responsibility that the state has for people coming from other countries,
yeah,
and obviously there's a difference in the reasons people are coming over. So obviously we help people, we help some Ukrainians come over eventually, and there's different claims for asylum and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Varying reasons, varying stages of or levels of desperation and things, reasons for people coming here.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe there should be a boundary to our responsibility for others, because out of prudence, and also I think if we had sort of open borders, if all countries had open borders, I just don't think that would help. I don't think that would be a healthy way to. Yeah, I'm just not sure about how healthy that would be.
Well, let me just. We've got 3 minutes left on the camera. If we have a welfare system, the way we currently do, and if the expectation is that the stranger and the foreigner is entitled to public, not private, public charity, i.e., violence on the part of the government through taxation to take your money and give it to someone else. Whether you agree with that or not, that's fundamentally what it is, coercion. If that's your assumption, I'm totally with you. But I'm working off of a different framework here, is that if people want to come here, just like everybody else, you throw yourself into the mix and you start producing, you start creating. And the way that a capitalist economy imperfectly operates is that you have to serve others. That's how it works. You serve the needs of others. If you don't get paid because you're not offering anything that people want. In a managed economy, a planned economy, that's very, very different. Now, there are multiple problems with that, but I'm working off the assumption here that we've got ideals that we need to be working towards. And one of those ideals is porous borders, not no border, but more that the border is an administrative limit on the state, not the individual or the family. I, as an individual, as a family, if I'm committed a crime, I should be free to move wherever I want. It's God's planet, it's God's earth. And I'm not causing a crime against anyone. If I'm trespassing on private property, that's maybe a different matter. But again, we have this another assumption that the state has the right of eminent domain to the entirety of the British Isles. And I don't believe that's the case. You know, use the example of the wall, Trump's wall in America. Well, what was remarkable about that is that people were initially clamoring for that. And then all of a sudden they turned around and were complaining. The government's kind of stealing my land. All of these people that had land on the border were like, I don't want a wall here, but the government's taking my land. Either they've forced me to sell it at below market rate. I don't know. But basically, we got 1 minute left. Yeah. I would say though, I see where you're coming from, and if we're working in that framework, then yes, there's problems. But I don't think that those, again, two wrongs don't make a right. We need to fix those problems as well. In order to be fundamentally a society that's just and righteous.
Interesting.
But, in this dying embers of this third episode, I would say we've got to trust God. We've got to cleave to his law before man's legal. And we have to recognize that human beings fundamentally, on the whole, produce more than they take. And if we want more producers, you think about America from 1870 to 1920, that's where I think it's Staten Island. Give me your yearning masses, your huddling masses. Come to me. I will be that light. And they arrived in droves, and America became the powerhouse economy of the world.
Mhm.
Yeah, no,
Is that what we're aiming
yeah, you
for,
know,
right? I'm just asking questions tonight. I'm pushing back. I'm just
that's
pushing
all
back on
right.
everything.
I like it. I like it.
Uh,
Okay, shall we stop there and then restart?
yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
Right. So just make a really good point at the end, because we're both
So,
mates and
yeah.
we love Jesus, and yet we've arrived at slightly different conclusions on the question of migration, the role of the government. You made a really good comment then.
So I think right. It was only almost right at the end of just recording that I kind of realised that your view stems from a starting position that is very different to my starting position, which is essentially that the way I'd call it then, your view is, and this will probably come out in future episodes, you have a very small government view of how the state should run. And the responsibility of a state and responsibility of individuals and that idea of kind of self-determination of an individual and what they should be able to do versus the state. And I think that firmly sort of undergirds your view, which gives me um, which puts me in a lot more agreement or leaves me with a lot more to think about than just kind of going, oh, I don't know about that and pushing back on it. Whereas I think my view comes, and you kind of nailed this as well at the end, comes a bit more from, well, what are the motivations for people to come here? How much is the state offering support? And
Yeah.
therefore, how does that attract people to come to the UK? So it's interesting how I think we've come at that from very different angles, but probably
I,
because,
I used to be very much, I suppose, for even further in, in the camp that you're hinting at. I some listeners that and viewers who know me have heard the story of basically how the Holy Spirit just wrecked me in Russia, and it'd be awesome to have a conversation about this, my experiences as an immigrant, because I was never abused as an immigrant, but boy, did I feel vulnerable. And language barriers, fear of the police, everything. And I was in provincial Russia, you know, and I saw part of what the Holy Spirit did direct me, which just showed me the dead end. There is no natural way out once a society backslides. In the case of Russia, it's had a quirky Orthodox Christian religion ripped root and stock by bloody murder at the hands of the communists. It was ripped out. Now, there's a very, very interesting discussion there about the covenantal judgment of God, what role providence had in that. When you consider Deuteronomy 28, things don't happen by accident. God is the architect, right? He oversees, has plans for all things, but it's left a stinking, stagnant society that needs salt and light to go in and refresh and reform, rejuvenate that place. Otherwise, it will stay. It will just continue to stink. It will continue to rot. And so that gave me, first of all, a kick up the arse to really find out what God's got to say about politics, about economics, about culture. And then gave me a kick up the arse to think, I can't be pessimistic about the future because I've seen what pessimism leads to, and it
right.
doesn't lead anywhere. If I'm just kind of saying a prayer, going to heaven, and then just sit on my computer watching prophecy reports, of the red heifer and all of these readings into dispensational prophecies, watching the time just in case Jesus is around the corner. I was like, why would I even have kids? Genuinely, I was struck by depression. Why would I have kids? Why would I plant trees that I will never see grow? Why would I do anything? And that experience, I suppose, brought me out of that paralysis, but it also sparked a few-year process of thinking, what does God have to fundamentally say about things? it really was such a traumatic experience that I came back home thinking, right, I've got some homework to do, and I really want to know what God's got to say about this. And one of them that I realized, and it was so interesting during the COVID lockdown, seeing how a fulcrum Bible verse for me on the role of the state was, I believe, abused by so many churchmen in this country, and that is Romans 13. So many people use Romans 13 as basically a cudgel, what the government says. When it tells you to do it, you do it, because that's glorifying to God. I do not understand it like that. I understand it in light, I believe, of the Reformed tradition that the government is a magistrate, the lesser magistrate serving the king that is Christ. And the government has responsibilities to him. It has some rights that are given to it. It is given the sword. It's told, wield the sword so that evildoers will fear you. The righteous and those who keep the law will rejoice because they're being defended, they're being avenged. And so whenever I see the government going out of its lane, so to speak, immediately I'm thinking, God, you have not ordained this as your standard. Now, Israel had kings. Israel had kings. You look at what God tells Samuel to say. God said through Samuel to the people of Israel, you will know you're under tyranny when the king takes a tenth of your produce. That is to say that a 10% income tax God considers tyranny. I would love a 10% income tax. I would love that. That's how deeply entrenched the whole world at the moment is in humanistic slavery. We have this, I mentioned in the previous episode, even like the suffragettes. Suffragettes were fighting against an Enlightenment patriarchy, not a biblical view of men and women. It was an Enlightenment, humanistic, evolutionist, eugenicist, sort of all of this filth coming out of the same petri dish of humanist Enlightenment thinking. That women were lesser, fundamentally lesser, and that is not a biblical view. So that sparks another conversation whenever I see that in the Christian world, an Enlightenment, humanistic perspective on patriarchy and the role of men and women, I immediately kick back against that as well, because I think I am a pragmatist in some sense. I can recognize in a short-term situation when the lesser of two evils is perhaps better, but fundamentally when it comes to reform, agitating radically for radical reform, I think, no, it's got to be God's standard first. It's got to be God's principle.
I think we've got another topic for another day as well there. On the
have you got anything to say on that, and then we can kind of bring all of this into the end of the previous episode?
Yeah, no, nothing to add. I just wanted to highlight the difference in starting positions, because I thought it's just something I reflected on. So yeah, no,
it was a really insightful point. I hadn't appreciated it the same way that you brought it up, which is why I thought let's get that recorded.
That's cool.
All right, mate.